You know, when you think of an ancient king, what comes to mind? Probably absolute power, right? Gold, pyramids, a ruler whose word is law. But for the kings of ancient Mesopotamia, we're talking the cradle of civilization here. That's really only half the story. Their real job, well, it was way more complex, and honestly, a lot more modern than you'd probably guess.
So what was a king's real job description 4,000 years ago? I mean, what was it really like to be a king in, say, Babylon or Assyria? What was actually on that divine to-do list? All right, let's get into it. We're going to deconstruct the very nature of power in one of the world's first great civilizations. Okay, first things first. Let's get our bearings. We are covering a huge stretch of history here, over 1,500 years. Just look at this timeline. We're starting way back with the old Babylonian period, Hammurabi, the famous lawgiver. Then we move through the rise and fall of the Hittites and Assyrians, all the way to the Neo-Babylonian Empire of Nebuchadnezzar II. So yeah, this isn't just about one kingdom. It's a whole series of massive empires.
So to really get a handle on what these kings did, you gotta start with where their power came from. And for the Mesopotamians, the answer was simple, almost self-evident. Power didn't come from the people. Nope, it came straight from the gods.
And this is the foundational idea. For them, kingship itself wasn't some human invention. It was a cosmic force that literally descended from heaven. And this wasn't just some abstract thought either. It was symbolized by actual physical objects, the scepter, the tiara, and the shepherd's crook. They believed these were all sent down from the gods directly to humanity.
And get this, they even had a specific word for it, Bala. It basically meant a term of office. Now, this is fascinating, right? Because it shows they had this abstract idea of the state, an institution that was bigger than any one person. The power wasn't just in the king, it was in the office of the king.
This quote from Hammurabi just nails that mindset. I am the sun god of Babylon. He saw himself as the bridge, the connection between the divine world and the human one. Now, here's a really key difference between Mesopotamia and, say, ancient Egypt. In Egypt, the pharaohs were seen as living gods, but rulers like Hammurabi, they saw themselves more as divine agents, the earthly expression of a god's power. It's a subtle but super important distinction.
Okay, so that brings us to the king's actual job description. If your boss is literally a god, what's on your daily to-do list? Well, it boils down to three main jobs, all wrapped up in one powerful metaphor. The king was the shepherd of his people.
And I mean, this shepherd idea is everywhere in their texts. The whole concept wasn't about domination. It was about protection, guidance, and responsibility. In this quote, you can see Hammurabi frames his entire reign as this act of sheltering his people, of making sure they're safe and prosperous.
So a shepherd's first duty? Keep the gods happy. That meant the king was basically the nation's high priest. His religious duties were a huge part of the job. Building and rebuilding temples, performing sacred rituals for everyone, and even ceremonially carrying the very first brick for a new temple. Seriously, this was job number one. Everything else depended on it.
And that divine duty was tied directly to the economy. It makes sense, right? Happy gods meant good harvests. So the king had these critical economic responsibilities. He had to build and maintain the massive irrigation canals, which were the absolute lifeblood of the civilization. But it went even further than that. He was also expected to control the prices of essential goods like oil, and even provide a social safety net to stop people from going hungry. At the end of the day, a prosperous kingdom was seen as proof that the gods were on your side.
All right, so beyond pleasing the gods and feeding the people, the king had another absolutely crucial role. He was the supreme judge. He was tasked with, well, engineering justice for his entire society.
This right here is the famous justification from the intro to Hammurabi's law code. The whole purpose of royal justice was crystal clear: to protect the vulnerable. The king's job was to step in and fix the imbalances in society, to defend the powerless from the powerful.
And this reveals a really deep belief they had. The king didn't create justice out of thin air. He was just the agent of this cosmic order of truth and rightness they called 𝙎𝙃𝘼𝘁. His unique gift wasn't inventing laws, but having the divine insight to see what was right, and then his job was to translate that into practical everyday rules for his people. So think about it. If your goal is to protect the weak and make sure justice is permanent, what's the solution? How do you do that?
This led them to one of the most revolutionary innovations in human history. You write it down. You carve it in stone for everyone to see.
This is a huge leap forward for civilization. Hammurabi is literally saying that any citizen with a legal problem should come and read the law for themselves on this stone pillar, this stela. This public written code gave ordinary people direct access to their rights. And that's a concept that was completely alien in a place like ancient Egypt, where the law was just whatever the king said it was that day.
Okay, so we have a king who's appointed by the gods who acts as a priest, a provider, and a lawgiver. That sounds pretty absolute, right? But, and this is where the story gets really interesting, there's a fascinating twist, and that brings us to a major historical debate.
So, was the Mesopotamian king's power truly absolute? Well, the evidence suggests maybe not. Scholars have been debating this for a long time, and what they've found really challenges that whole idea of an all-powerful, untouchable monarch.
Let's just look at the conflicting evidence side by side. On the one hand, you've got texts that sound completely absolutist. Stuff like, the command of the palace cannot be altered. But then, on the other hand, you find all this evidence of citizen power. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, the hero Gilgamesh has to consult the city elders before he goes to war. We have actual records of city assemblies acting as courts and passing verdicts in murder cases. And you have these powerful merchant groups, called the Karam, that often acted totally on their own. So, what's going on here?
So how do we square this circle? Well, one leading theory is that it was a kind of two-tier system. You have an absolute emperor or great king at the very top, but the individual cities under his rule still had a ton of autonomy. They were largely managing their own local legal and business affairs through their own citizen assemblies. It's kind of like an ancient form of indirect rule.
All right, for our final section, let's put all of this into perspective. And honestly, the best way to appreciate just how unique the Mesopotamian system was is to compare it to its famous rival civilization right next door, Egypt. And wow, the contrast is just stark. The Egyptian pharaoh, a living god. The Mesopotamian king, a divine agent. In Egypt, the law was whatever the pharaoh said. In Mesopotamia, it was a written code that, in theory, even a regular person could go and look at.
But the single biggest, most crucial difference is this: the existence of citizen groups in Mesopotamia, assemblies, elders, merchant guilds that held real judicial and political power. That kind of civic participation was just completely, totally absent in Egypt.
So as we've peeled back all these layers, we can see the Mesopotamian king wasn't some simple tyrant. He was this incredibly complex figure, a divine agent on earth, a shepherd and provider for his people, a lawgiver protecting the weak, and yeah, an absolute ruler, but one whose power might have been surprisingly limited by the very citizens he governed.
And all of this leaves us with one final, and I think timeless question. If a king's power comes from the gods, but his laws are meant to protect the people, then who truly holds him accountable? Is it the gods who gave him the crown, or is it the people he swore to protect? That fundamental tension, well, that's something politics has been grappling with for the 4,000 years since.